6:42 a.m. Vyrex Aerospace's private hangar is shrouded in mist, heavy with the scent of fuel and failure. A $40 million jet engine lies dead on the floor. Deadline: 4 hours before the contract of a lifetime vanishes. Alexandra Reed, the Billionaire CEO, arrives, her heels echoing like a countdown. 17 engineers fail. Impossible, they say, staring at blank monitors. In the corner, Mark Hale, a poor single dad, stands by his rusty tool cart, ignored. Anyone else? Alexandra mocks. Mark whispers, "Give me 15 minutes. Laughter erupts, but those 15 minutes will flip their worlds upside down forever. Mark Hale lives in a world of echoes and grease. At 42, his life is defined by a small, drafty apartment on the edge of the industrial district and the bright, hopeful eyes of his 9-year-old daughter, Emma. He is a man who has learned to be invisible, a shadow moving through the high-tech corridors of Vyrex Aerospace. He works 3 jobs just to keep the lights on: a delivery driver at night, a handyman on weekends, and a seasonal helper at Vyrex during the peak rush. He wears a faded navy jumpsuit that has seen better decades, and his hands are permanently stained with the honest grime of hard labor, a map of oil and sweat etched into his skin. Mark wasn't always just a helper pushing a broom. 20 years ago, he was the rising star of the MIT aerospace program, the top of his class, a man who spoke the language of turbines and fluid dynamics as if it were his mother tongue. He had a gift, a strange, intuitive connection to anything that roared and burned fuel. He could tell the health of a combustion chamber just by the smell of the exhaust. But life has a violent way of shattering plans. A family tragedy followed by the sudden aggressive illness of his wife, Sarah, forced him to walk away from his dreams. He dropped out of his doctoral program, sold his patents for pennies to pay for medical bills, and spent years in hospital rooms. After Sarah passed, Mark's world narrowed down to one single precious point: Emma. He chose to stay close to home, taking menial jobs that allowed him to be the dad who walks Emma to school every morning and tucks her in every night. He turned down high-paying corporate roles in distant cities because he refused to let a nanny raise the only piece of Sarah he had left. To the world, he was a dropout. To Emma, he was everything. To the engineers at Vyrex, he was just the janitor with the toolbox. In the high-tech environment of Vyrex, Mark is treated like part of the furniture. The elite engineers with their PhDs from Ivy League schools and their sleek $1,000 tablets barely look at him as they discuss thermal expansion coefficients and digital twin simulations. But Mark does something they've forgotten how to do. He doesn't just look at the digital sensors, he listens, he feels. For the past 3 days, while sweeping the metal shavings from the floor, Mark has been hearing a rhythmic, irregular vibration coming from the massive X-1 jet engine mounted on the test stand. It wasn't a loud noise. It was a subtle, haunting hum, a micro-flutter that didn't show up on any of the sophisticated monitoring software. It was the sound of a machine in pain. He had tried to mention it to a junior engineer once, a bright kid named Kevin who was busy staring at a 3D model on his iPad. Kevin had laughed, not even looking up. "Stick to the broom, Mark. The computers say the harmonics are perfect. Maybe you just need some earplugs." Now, that perfect engine is dead, and the silence in the hangar is more deafening than any roar. Alexandra Reed stands in the center of the hangar, her tailored charcoal suit sharp enough to cut glass. She is a woman built on data, cold logic, and absolute results. To her, a delay isn't just a loss of money. It's a crack in the foundation of the empire she built, from nothing but grit and ruthless ambition. She has a billion-dollar contract with a sovereign wealth fund on the line, and her reputation is pinned to this specific 10 a.m. delivery. She doesn't have time for maybes, errors, or excuses. "We've run every diagnostic 3 times, the lead engineer, Dr. Aries, stammers. His face is pale under the harsh LED hangar lights, sweat beading on his forehead despite the air conditioning. The software says the fuel lines are clear, the turbines are balanced, the igniters are sparking, but the combustion cycle just won't sustain. It's like the physics themselves are failing. We need to tear it down to the core. It'll take 48 hours minimum. We have to call the client. Alexandra's gaze sweeps the room like a searchlight, landing on the group of defeated men. She sees their fear, their reliance on screens, and their utter lack of vision. Her frustration, built up over hours of watching them fail, boils over into a cold, mocking laugh that echoes off the steel girders. $40 million of technology, the smartest minds in the country, and you're telling me it's a paperweight? She asks, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Is there anyone in this building who isn't blinded by a computer screen? Anyone who actually knows how an engine works? Or did you all forget that in your fancy seminars? Her eyes, sharp and restless, accidentally lock onto Mark. He is standing near his rusty tool cart, his hands resting on a worn-out wrench. He isn't looking at her. He's looking at the engine's intake manifold, his head tilted slightly to the side as if he's still hearing that ghost vibration in the silence. He's thinking about his rent, which is 3 days overdue. He's thinking about the letter from the landlord sitting on his kitchen table next to Emma's drawing of a rocket ship. He's thinking that if he loses this seasonal gig, they'll be on the street by the weekend. You, Alexandra says, pointing a manicured finger at him. The engineers turn, shocked. The one with the cart. You've been staring at that turbine for 10 minutes, like you're having a conversation with it. You think you know better than these experts? The hangar goes quiet. A few engineers smirk, covering their mouths. They expect a stammering apology or a confused look. They wait for the punchline of the joke. Mark doesn't flinch. He doesn't look intimidated. He steps forward, his heavy work boots clicking on the polished epoxy floor. He doesn't ask for permission anymore. He has nothing left to lose and a daughter to protect. I don't need 48 hours, Mark says, his voice low, steady, and resonant. And I don't need a laptop to tell me what I can hear with my own ears. If you give me 15 minutes of silence, and if you tell your experts to stop talking, I can make it roar. Alexandra Reed crosses her arms, her eyes narrowing until they are just slits of icy blue. She sees the desperation in Mark's eyes. Yes, but she also sees a spark of something she hasn't seen all morning. Absolute, unshakable certainty. It's a look she recognizes from her own mirror. 15 minutes, she says, her voice echoing through the vast space. But understand the stakes, Mr. Hale. If you touch that engine and fail, or worse, damage it, you're out of this hangar for good. No pay, no references. I'll make sure you never work in this industry again. Deal? Deal, Mark replies without a second of hesitation. The engineers whisper and scoff as Mark approaches the $40 million beast. This is insane, Dr. Eris mutters. He's going to ruin the calibration. But Alexandra raises a hand, silencing him. She wants to see this. She needs to see this. Mark doesn't touch the high-tech control panels. He doesn't even pick up a wrench at first. Instead, he asks for something that makes the engineers laugh out loud. A secondary startup cycle. A low-power test that usually only checks the interior lighting systems and the auxiliary battery. What is he doing? A senior tech mumbles. That won't show anything about the combustion failure. It's like checking the headlights on a car with a blown engine. Mark ignores them. He moves toward the engine casing, his movements fluid and precise. He presses his ear against the cold, high-grade titanium of the housing. He closes his eyes. To the observers, he looks like he's praying to a mechanical god. To Mark, he is visualizing the air flowing through the compression stages. He is feeling the resonance of the cooling fans. He is looking for the hiccup in the heartbeat. Turn it off, Mark says suddenly, his eyes snapping open. He points to a tiny secondary pressure sensor tucked deep into the left side of the intake. Disable this sensor. Manually, don't just bypass it in the software. Pull the lead. We can't do that, Dr. Eris protests, stepping forward. That's against every safety protocol in the Vyrex manual. That sensor regulates the pre-ignition pressure. If we pull that, the main CPU will go into an emergency lockdown. The sensor says the pressure is fine, perfectly within the green zone. The sensor is lying to your CPU because it's being lied to by the environment. Mark fires back, his voice sharpening with a command that makes the junior engineers jump. When the temperature rises during the preheat, the mounting bracket for that sensor expands by less than a millimeter, a manufacturing flaw in the alloy. It creates a reverse resonance that mirrors the actual pressure wave. The data on your screen looks static and green because the error is perfectly canceling out the truth. You're looking at the map. I'm looking at the road. Pull the lead. Alexandra watches him closely. She's a gambler at heart. It's how she made her first billion, and she likes the way this man talks. He isn't guessing. He's witnessing. Pull the lead, Alexandra commands. Dr. Aris hesitates, then nods to a tech. The lead is pulled. Mark then asks about the origin of the latest replacement parts for the fuel delivery system. He discovers that while the parts meet the Vyrex Standard 7, they were manufactured in a different facility with a slightly different elasticity in the synthetic seals. It's a tiny detail, a decimal point in a specification sheet, invisible to a computer diagnostic, but catastrophic for a high-performance engine under stress. Remove the third seal ring from the primary injector, Mark orders, picking up a specialized torque wrench. The hangar erupts in genuine panic. That ring is essential for the vacuum seal, the lead tech screams. If he removes that, and we attempt ignition, the back pressure will blow the injector right out of the housing. The whole unit could explode. You're risking lives, Alexandra. Mark looks directly at Alexandra, ignoring the shouting men. It won't explode. It'll breathe. The ring is too tight for the high humidity air we have in the hangar this morning. It's creating a vacuum lock that's choking the initial spark before it can reach the fuel-air mix. It's like trying to light a match in a vacuum. Give the engine air, and it will give you fire. The engineers turn to Alexandra, expecting her to shut him down, to call security, to end this madness. The air in the room is thick with the smell of ozone and tension. The digital clock on the wall reflects in Alexandra's eyes. 7:15 a.m. Finally, Alexandra speaks. Her voice is a cold blade that brooks no argument. Do it. Move out of his way. Let's see if this helper is a genius who understands the soul of a machine, or just a man looking for a way to get fired faster. The silence in the hangar is heavy, a physical weight that seems to push down on the spectators. The only sounds are the rhythmic clink-clink of Mark's tools and his steady, even breathing. Every eye is glued to his hands. He works with a grace that Dr. Aris recognizes. It's the movement of someone who has spent thousands of hours inside the guts of a machine. Mark carefully removes the third seal ring. He doesn't just toss it aside. He examines it under the light, seeing the microscopic wear that confirms his theory. He then adjusts the mounting angle of the fuel injector by a fraction of a degree, a movement so small it's almost unnoticeable to the naked eye, a tweak that no computer would ever suggest. Clear the area, Mark says, his voice flat. He walks over to the ignition switch. He doesn't look at the engineers. He doesn't look at Alexandra. He looks at the engine as if it were an old, tired friend that just needed a little help finding its breath. He remembers Sarah's last days, how he had learned to monitor every breath, every heartbeat, how he had become an expert in the fragile mechanics of life. He channels that focus now. He presses the ignition button. For 3 agonizing seconds, there is only the high-pitched whine of the starter motor. It's the sound of failure. The engineers begin to smirk. Dr. Aris starts to reach for his phone to call the client and admit defeat. Alexandra looks at her watch, her face a mask of disappointment. Then, a cough. A sudden, violent puff of blue smoke from the exhaust bypass. And then, a roar that shakes the very foundation of the building. The engine doesn't just start, it sings. The sound is a perfect guttural hum that vibrates through the epoxy floor, through the steel walls, and deep into the chests of everyone standing there. It is the sound of absolute crystalline mechanical harmony. The lead engineer frantically checks his tablet, his eyes widening until they look like they might pop out. The data, it's perfect. No, it's better than perfect. The thermal stability is 12% higher than the factory specs. The fuel-to-thrust ratio is off the charts. How is that possible with a missing seal? Alexandra steps forward, her heels clicking on the floor. She doesn't say a word. She stands in the blast of the warm, powerful air coming from the intake bypass, her hair whipping around her face, her eyes fixed on the man in the dirty jumpsuit. Mark is simply wiping his hands on a grease-stained rag, his face expressionless, as if he knew this would happen all along. "Run it at 80% load," Mark says calmly, his voice easily cutting through the roar. They ramp it up. The engine holds. It's flawless. The impossible fix took exactly 14 minutes and 30 seconds. Twist 1. Alexandra stares at the way Mark adjusted the injector. Something about that specific, non-standard mounting angle triggers a memory. "Where did you learn to adjust a mounting angle like that, Mr. Hale?" she asks, her voice barely audible over the turbine. "That isn't in any modern textbook. That's a signature of the original X1 series design lab, a technique used by the prototype team 20 years ago." Mark hesitates, a flicker of pain crossing his face. He looks at the engine, then back at her. "I was an intern at the Henderson Design Lab 20 years ago. I helped draft the initial fluid dynamic schematics for this flow path before the efficiency experts took over and started cutting corners for the shareholders." The room goes dead silent. The Henderson Lab was the birthplace of Vyrex's core technology. The intern they were talking about was a legend, a student who had disappeared after a tragedy, leaving behind work that the company had coasted on for 2 decades. Twist 2. Mark reaches into the bottom drawer of his rusty tool cart and pulls out a tattered, oil-stained notebook. He flips to a page dated 15 years ago, covered in complex equations and hand-drawn diagrams. It's a safety patch note, one that predicted this exact resonance failure in high-humidity environments. "This was rejected by the board," Mark says, handing the book to Alexandra. "The note at the bottom says it would have increased production costs by $12.40 per unit. It has your signature at the bottom of the denied column, Ms. Reed. You saved $12 back then, and it almost cost you a $40 million engine and a $1 billion contract today." Alexandra takes the book, her fingers trembling slightly. She sees her own younger, more arrogant handwriting. She realizes that she had authorized the very flaw that almost destroyed her company today. She looks at the man in the dirty jumpsuit, the man she had let the system ignore, the man who had been sweeping her floors while holding the keys to her empire's survival. The hangar is silent again, but the power has shifted. The contract is saved. The stock prices will surge when the news of the successful test hits the wire, but the woman who owns it all feels suddenly, sharply small. "You aren't a poor man, Mark," Alexandra says, her voice unusually soft, almost human. "The system, my system, just made you poor because we stopped looking at people and started looking at spreadsheets. The aftermath is a whirlwind of corporate reckoning. Alexandra Reed does something she hasn't done in a decade. She cancels all her morning meetings, including the call with the Sovereign Wealth Fund. She orders a closed-door session right there on the hangar floor. No mahogany boardroom, no catered lunch. Just the smell of jet fuel, the hum of the engine, and the raw truth. The elite engineers are forced to stand in a line like schoolboys. They have to explain, to her and to Mark, why they missed a flaw that a helper found with his bare ears. One by one, they admit they relied too much on the digital twin software. They admit they stopped walking the floor. They admit they looked down on Mark because of his faded jumpsuit and his rusty cart. "I want every protocol in this company rewritten by the end of the week," Alexandra commands, her voice cold and final. "From now on, if a technician on the floor hears something off, we stop the line. We don't wait for a sensor to trip. We don't wait for a software flag. We listen to the human beings who actually touch the machines. And Dr. Aris, you're going to spend the next month in the assembly bay learning how to use a wrench again." She then turns to Mark. The atmosphere changes. She offers him the position of chief technical consultant, a role that comes with a 7-figure salary, stock options that would change his life overnight, and a corner office with a view of the city. Mark looks at the contract she's holding out. He looks at the sleek fountain pen. Then he looks at his watch, a cheap plastic Casio with a scratched face. "I have to pick up Emma from school at 3 p.m., he says, his voice quiet but firm. "I don't do overtime. I don't do weekend travel. I don't do emergency board meetings. My daughter comes first. Always." The room is stunned into a second silence. Nobody says no to Alexandra Reed. Nobody turns down $1 million. Alexandra looks at the tattered notebook again, then at the small blurred picture of Emma tucked into the inside cover. She sees the devotion in Mark's tired face. She sees a wealth that she, for all her billions, has never truly possessed. Instead of getting angry, she smiles. A real, genuine smile that reaches her eyes. Then we'll make the schedule flexible, she says. We'll build a lab for you right here. You pick your own hours. Vyrex needs your ears and your soul more than you need our money, Mark. Let us try to earn your time. That afternoon, a black luxury SUV pulls up to a local, slightly run-down elementary school. It looks out of place among the battered sedans and minivans. Alexandra Reed herself steps out of the back seat, her presence drawing stares from the other parents. She waits next to Mark as the bell rings. Emma runs out, her backpack bouncing. She stops when she sees the tall, powerful woman in the charcoal suit standing next to her dad. "Daddy, who is the lady?" Emma asks, hiding behind Mark's leg. "Is she the lady who shouts at people on the news?" Alexandra kneels down, her expensive silk trousers touching the playground dirt without a second thought. "Sometimes I am, Emma," she says softly. "But your dad taught me something very important today. He taught me that sometimes it's better to be quiet and listen to the things everyone else is too busy to hear." A new standard is born at Vyrex. The culture of the hangar changes. The gap between the experts in the offices and the workers on the floor begins to close. Mark signs the contract, but he refuses the corner office. He keeps his station on the hangar floor, though he gets a brand new top-of-the-line tool cart. He keeps his old worn-out wrench, though, as a reminder, because he knows that the best way to hear the truth is to stay close to the heart of the machine. Life changes for the Hales, but Mark Hale stays the same man. He still walks Emma to school every morning, though now they live in a house with a yard and a roof that doesn't leak when it rains. He still cooks simple dinners and helps with homework. He doesn't buy a mansion in the hills or a fleet of sports cars. He just pays off his debts, sets up a massive college fund for Emma, and buys back the patents he lost 20 years ago. In the Vyrex hangar, the atmosphere has transformed. The young engineers no longer walk past the technicians with their heads in their tablets. They stop. They talk. They ask, "Mark, what do you hear today?" Before they trust a digital readout, they trust the man who knows how to listen to the silence between the beats. Alexandra Reed is different too. She spends more time on the hangar floor than in the penthouse. She has stopped scoffing at irregularities. She has learned that a billion-dollar empire is only as strong as the people the world tries to ignore. She and Mark become an unlikely but formidable team, the CEO who looks at the future and the engineer who remembers the soul of the past. Late one afternoon, the luxury jet finally takes off into a deep purple sunset, its engines roaring with a perfect, healthy, and powerful resonance. Mark stands at the massive hangar door, his arms crossed over his chest, watching the lights of the plane fade into the distance. He doesn't need his name on the side of the building. He doesn't need the fame. He just needs to know the job was done right. He feels the ghost of Sarah's smile in the cool evening breeze. Emma is waiting for him by the gate, sitting on her new bike. "Did you fix a big plane today, Daddy? Was it a record?" Mark picks her up, the orange glow of the sunset reflecting in their eyes. "No, Em, I just listened a little closer than everyone else. That's all it ever takes." As the plane disappears into the clouds, Alexandra Reed stands on the observation deck high above, watching the single dad walk toward his car with his daughter. She realizes that the most impossible fix she witnessed today wasn't the engine. It was her own perspective. She had been searching for a solution in the machines, but she found it in the man who refused to be broken by the system. Nothing is impossible when you finally decide to listen to the right person. If you believe stories like this deserve to be told, leave a comment and subscribe to TT Healing Tales. Some voices are too important to be ignored,